Hey, this is Matthew with BI Polar. In today's data culture video, we're going to take a look at the important factor of executive sponsorship. I hope you'll join me. Hey, in today's video, we're going to take a look at one of the most significant factors for successfully adopting a self-service BI tool and building a data culture with it, and that is having an executive sponsor. Now, as you know from the introductory video in this series, what we're really trying to do with this video and others is to present patterns and practices that I've observed successful large companies following as they're adopting Power BI at global enterprise scale. Now, I struggled with choosing executive sponsorship as the first substantive video in the series following the introduction for one big reason. It's hard to say how to do it, or how to get or to find an executive sponsor. The reason that I chose it is because this is in many ways the high order bit for success. An executive sponsor and the position and the role of that executive sponsor in the organization will often define the scope of the data culture that's being created. And if you remember from the introductory series, the culture is the set of behaviors that are encouraged or discouraged. It's the behaviors that are exhibited by the members of the culture. That's the most important definition. And in many ways, the executive sponsor defines the scope of the culture as it's created. Even though having an executive sponsor is critical for the success and growth of a data culture, it would be wrong to interpret this as meaning that a data culture must grow from the top down. This is often not the case. Many successful data cultures will grow organically bottom up, where individual users and teams and departments will adopt tools and practices, doing more things with data and making more decisions with data, growing from the bottom without a top-level strategic direction first being set. But eventually, when you grow beyond that small scale, there needs to be someone in a position of power or a position of authority to provide the support and the resources and eventually the momentum to keep it going after those initial efforts have succeeded. One of the most common successful patterns that we will see for executive sponsorship is at the executive level or at the C level that the organization will adopt a chief data officer or CDO. Very often, this chief data officer position is a new position. A lot of big organizations today will have one, but it's not something that medium or smaller organizations can take for granted today. But the creation of a CDO role is often a signal that the broader organization is starting to take the value of data as both a component or ingredient for ongoing success, or as a factor for differentiation and success in the global marketplace, that they're starting to take this more and more seriously. Very often, the chief data officer position is either hired from outside the company to bring in a new perspective and change the way that things are thought about or the way that data is thought about, or the CDO may be promoted from the business where even though this is a position with a lot of technical influence and technical authority, the focus of that position is on the value that data and data technology brings to business operations. If we don't have a CDO to work with, very often the role and position of the executive sponsor for the adoption of the data tools and culture will determine the scope and the scale of that culture's influence. If the executive sponsor is at the C level, if it's the CEO or the CDO or another senior executive, often this means that the data culture is something that will spread across the entire organization or the entire enterprise. If the executive is at a smaller level, so if this is a junior executive or a director level senior manager, this can often mean that the data culture is still in the process of growing and that the importance of data as a business driver or as a differentiator is not yet fully known across the organization. And often this means that the characteristics of the data culture, remember the culture is the behaviors and actions that people do. You know, culture is what you do, it's not what you say, it's not the rules, it is the behaviors exhibited to follow and to grow within those rules. That if you have a director level or lower level executive sponsor, this often means that the scope and scale of the culture and those behaviors will not yet be fully widespread. And if we think why this is important, let's examine, or let's look at an example of a very typical business intelligence scenario where the analysts or BI developers that are developing solutions, that are preparing and delivering the data that will allow the business to make more and better and quicker data-driven decisions through that data culture, at some point they need access to a new data source. Specifically, if the data culture is still only a subset of the organization, eventually those users, those people will need access to data that they don't yet have permissions to access, or they don't yet have the full support to access in the way or the scope or the cadence that they need. This is where the executive sponsor will come in, because without access to the data source, a very common pattern is that if I can't access the transactional system, I will look for a data mart or data warehouse that already prepares and aggregates it. If I can't get access to that, I may look for a downstream analytics system, a cube or tabular model that already presents data for some older purpose, and I'll attempt to use that as my source for the new efforts that I have underway. And if I have to use that downstream analytic source, there are a lot of technical debt implications of using an analytic model as an ETL source. There will be a link to a blog post in the description below that goes into some of those, but essentially this is a worst practice. You know, decades of BI, decades of working with analytics and data warehousing solutions tells us that this is a worst practice. But very often, there's not a technical hurdle to getting access to the upstream data warehouse that we need. It's actually a political or organizational hurdle. And in these situations, often what is the best approach to take is to identify the owners of the different systems that are involved, and then you walk up the org chart. I keep making a triangle with my hands because in my mind I'm picturing the organizational tree or org chart with the executives at the top and the rest of the organization at the leaf or lower nodes below. But essentially, to get access to this data that we need, we'll identify the owners, either business or technical or both, the owners of the various systems, and then we walk up to find who is the first common manager, first common leader that has influence and authority over both parts of the organization. And in order to have the political solution to these challenges, we need to be able to identify them and engage with them to be successful. And if our executive sponsor is not senior enough to influence all of those managers, this will add additional hurdles or delays, and in a lot of circumstances it may actually provide blockers that will force us to access a less than ideal data source or to implement a less than ideal technical solution because of a non-technical hurdle up front. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that I struggled with having this be one of the first videos in the series because there's not a lot of actionable advice that I can give here. Your organization is going to be different from every other organization in the world, and there's no real way for me to say, take these steps to find the right executive sponsor or to get the executive support for your efforts. But what I will say is that as you're following the steps that are outlined in later videos in the series, or if you're proactively following along in the Power BI adoption framework, and you find that following this advice is harder than it seems, or you're going through the steps that are recommended and you're struggling or you're failing, if you don't have an executive sponsor, this is the red flag. This will be the thing that makes all of the other steps that you do harder than it should be. If you don't have an executive sponsor, all of the other tactical and strategic and technical efforts that you undertake, that you begin, they're going to be harder than they would be if you had someone in a position of authority whose priorities and whose responsibilities aligned with the goals of your efforts to get more value and to make better decisions from more data. All right, that's what we have from today. Please let me know what you think, and please stay tuned for other videos in this series on building a data culture. We'll see you next time.